And this is a story based on a lesser-known tale by Hans Christian Andersen, and it's called The Shadow, and this is how I will tell it. When a pale Englishman finds himself in the heat of Morocco, in the sunshine of Morocco, it can be quite overwhelming. The heat and the light, and his shadow was strong and sharp on the walls of the buildings as he walked through the city. But he found that by the evening he was exhausted by the heat. And so he returned to his flat in the city and hid there. During the day, he had the shutters closed and only came out at the evening. And to be fair, his shadow was actually quite relieved to have a rest, having had to be so strong and sharp out in the daylight. And so the poor, pale Englishman stayed in low light until the evening came, when he opened the shadows and looked down onto the city, and his own shadow would be gently pressed against the wall behind him, sometimes split by the multiple lights outside his room. One evening, the man noticed something. He noticed that something had changed outside his window, that there was a bright source of light. Now, to be fair, he didn't notice the bright source of light. What he noticed, because he was facing away from the window, was his shadow on the wall, his shadow which was sharp and strong and bold. He turned round and looked, and over the other side of the road, in a room, there was a bright light, but the light wasn't coming from lamps or from candles or from mirrors. It was coming from a woman, and she seemed to be the very source of the light. And the pale Englishman watched in amazement as she moved out of the room. And as she moved out of the room into the next room, the light traveled with her until the room was dark. He turned round and looked at the wall behind him, and of course his shadow was once more soft and dispersed across the walls. He went and gathered all the lamps from his apartment and placed them on a table. He gathered all the mirrors and made a curve of the mirrors around the lamps. And then he stood in front of them and turned to face across the road. And he looked through the open window of the room across the road, and there on the far wall of that room was his shadow. And he said to his shadow, "Follow her. I want to know who she is." And so his shadow walked across the wall and disappeared as it left the room. The pale Englishman waited in his apartment for his shadow to return. All night he waited with the lamps burning, and of course the oil went down, and the lamps flickered, and the light faded, and he knew he would not see his shadow. The next morning he went down and stepped outside into the bright sunlight, and as he walked across the road towards the building opposite, he noticed he was missing something. For despite the bright light of a Morocco morning, he had no shadow on the wall. He knocked on the door, and a woman answered. Not the woman he'd seen who'd been the source of light, and he inquired after the woman who lived in the apartment on the first floor, and the landlady said, "No, she left. I don't know where she's gone. She came here for a few days, she disappeared. I am not her keeper." And so the poor, pale Englishman had to leave Morocco not knowing who she was, had to leave Morocco with no shadow. He returned to London and his apartment in London. Now, he could go out in the evenings because it was unlikely that anyone would notice that he didn't have a shadow. But of course, during the daytime, he had to stay in low light because anyone might see that this man walking through the streets of London in bright light had no shadow. But of course, living in London, the chances of having bright light were quite slim. And so he was fairly safe as long as he watched the weather. Many years passed, And he was in his apartment one day when he heard a knock at the door. It was a bright day, so he'd stayed inside with the shutters closed. And as he opened the door, he saw that the window in the hallway was pouring light onto the wall adjacent to the door. And on the wall, in the light, was a shadow that he recognized. And to him it seemed the shadow had more substance than it had had when it had been attached to him. And the shadow said, "I see you recognize me. Will you not invite me in?" And so the pale Englishman invited his shadow in, and his shadow told him his story. The shadow had gone across the wall, across the road, and onto the wall in the room opposite, and had followed the woman and discovered who she was. She was Story. And she showed him that to be truly human, he needed Story. And so the shadow made it his task to find Story. And being a shadow, of course, he could pass under doors. He could pass between the louvers of shutters. He could pass down the crack between a window and the frame. And he could go into homes and listen to other people's stories and make those stories his own and make the most of those stories, for the things he heard were not always savory. And over the years, he had become rich. So now he had stories aplenty, and yet still he was not truly human, for he lacked the substance of a human. And the pale Englishman started to fear as he saw the anger rising in the shadow in front of him, as the shadow said, "This is your doing. You cast me off. You sent me across the road, onto another wall, in another room, away from you. You separated me from you and cast me off. Now you must pay me. I want a companion. I want someone to walk alongside me so that I can feel truly human and gain substance." And the pale Englishman wanted to atone for all he had done to his own shadow by sending it across the road onto the wall on the room opposite. And so he agreed to be the companion of the shadow. And they walked out together. And they walked out together for many months, returning to the flat and living there when they needed to. And anyone who's seen them together might start to question, which was the human? Which was the shadow? And as the shadow gained substance, he decided it was time to finish this chapter of the story. And so he started to make excuses as to why they couldn't go out, and they stayed indoors. And he turned the lights down lower and lower until the pale Englishman was dispersed across the wall and flickered into nothingness. So, if on one of the rare bright days in London, you notice someone walking without a shadow, you may question, is he truly human? For he may have stories to tell, but whose substance does he have? And that is my version of Hans Christian Andersen's The Shadow, and that's how I've told it to you.